Chapter 9 The Story of Iron John and the Road of Ashes, Descent, and Grief. Dearest White Buffalo, do you ever wonder if something is wrong with us? I mean, what if I'm broken? Whenever I try to live in this world, I seem to find myself in all sorts of turbulent commotion.
To start, don't ever judge a work of art by its defects. If it's art we're creating, then it's the journey that art undergoes that makes it perfect. And perfect art isn't spotless, but rather, the best art might look like the painter or poet went through a battle or war. Real art goes through a transformation process, much like alchemy, all to prove that life and art are something worth fighting for,
said the White Buffalo. Beautiful. So then we're all great works of art.
Yes, because we've got the creative heart. And before we begin this next part of the story, I must tell you about alchemy's motto, which is, dissolve and coagulate. This means that something must be broken down before it can be built up,
said the White Buffalo. Then alchemy is some really tricky stuff.
An old alchemist gave the following consolation to one of his disciples. No matter how isolated you are and how lonely you feel, if you do your work truly and honorably, unknown friends will come and seek you.
The White Buffalo paused.
Now we've come to a new section of the story, and we might look back on my progress as a young man up until now. As the son of a noble king, I followed the wild man named Iron John, and have not gone the way of delinquency, drug addiction, and self-shaming, but rather on the contrary, I was lifted up to what is great in us. If we've taken this path up until now, we learn to trust our instinctual nature, and finally, we see eyes looking back from within the world as we gaze upon the surface of the sacred pond. There we see a reflection within nature, the grass, the trees, the animals, the plants, and the mountains. We learn that the whole world is one fire, one body, one mind, one spirit, and one heart. How everything is intelligent, and this is when the hair turns to gold. Such teachings can have strange effects. If such good luck happens to you, a friend would probably warn you that you were in danger of becoming overly grand. These teachings, moreover, got laid upon me when I was quite young, and that is one problem with going to the sacred spring with the wild man. And yet, we notice that many others received these similar teachings. Even though the lessons may have arrived in a fragmented form, one bit now and one bit then, scattered through months or years. For some, the teaching about eyes arrived in childhood, when we were amazed by the woods or gardens, and knew how nature was alive. The golden hair teaching may arrive at 12 or 14, which is fueled by sexual instinct we rouse or fall deeply in love, and we knew that this love felt good, very good. Later, when our teens came, we felt mental or physical abilities in us that we had never imagined. Each of us had already guessed that we were sons of kings and queens, and somehow had landed in our current families. Our grandiosity then was already in us, even if no visible wild man took us to his sacred pond. We know the feeling of grandeur, and we want to have it all the time. In order to keep the grandeur feeling, a child may refuse to remember ugly facts of childhood, may look away from disorganization, abuse, abandonment, lack of protection, or skip over parents' indifference, addictions, or any dark side. Animals apparently don't have to worry so much about inflation, but we are human beings and have a little bit of gold or genius feeling, and this can send us into high altitudes from which we don't want to descend,
said the White Buffalo. So what happens next?
Young men, when lifted up, may become white swans, Peter Pans, grandiose ascenders that we could call flying boys, just as young women, similarly, lifted up may become flying girls, and both make love with invisible people at high altitudes. The Jungian thinkers have done well in noticing and describing this phenomenon, and so they call it the holy or eternal boys and girls. In any case, these flying people, the woo-woo and spiritual, do not inhabit their own bodies well, and are open to terrible shocks of abandonment. They are unable to accept limitations and are averse to certain boring qualities native to human life. Beyond just Peter Pans, these flyers are connected to most ashram devotees or higher consciousness and determined to avoid certain food, platonic lovers, and celibates. Grandiose ascenders sometimes dream of rising in an elevator that is attached to the outside of a building, but when they get to the upper floor, they find themselves with no entrance to the building. The young holy boys are by no means negative. They love spirit and embody much of the spiritual energy in the nation. Their ascensions bring many blessings to the culture. Without them, the American culture would probably thicken and harden into concrete, so the grandiose ascender is a complicated person. I myself am a good example of a grandiose ascender, and we come out of all sorts of families, and sometimes the ascension is taken on as an intelligent survival method. A great poem to describe this is, "What does the sun do? He turns away, loses courage, goes outdoors to feed with the wild things, lives among dens and huts, eats distance and silence. He grows long wings, enters the spiral, and ascends." For me, I might have gotten a glimpse of that at 12 or so, and when I was 28, I still had the longing for purity, to be above it and not be involved. The evolution of the boy into a bird-like creature is a natural movement. He looks up at the light when he wants to escape, as do birds. Imprisoned birds flutter up the wall toward the cracks of light. So the young ascenders often find themselves achieving spirit, but at the expense of life, or their own grounding in the masculine life. I am not saying that spiritual work is wrong, not at all, but it's important to consider when in a person's life it should take place. Some say that a man's task in the first half of his life is to become bonded to a craft. We should also add that not all young men are ascenders. Some are earthbound and take on responsibility early, commit themselves to supporting others. They walk slowly, move close to the ground, carry enormous burdens, and may feel like they have no right to look at the slivers of sunlight. Their family tradition may be that the sun's grandiosity is to be wiped out early. Sometimes in those families, women are the inflated ones, and the men are not. And so often, men take the depressed road. They do not become artists or musicians. Their life takes place where the soles of their shoes touch the ground. As we look where I am in this story now, it is a moment of ascension. Many other people all over the world could be here, and so we might look at them in the light of 3 words: passivity, naivety, and numbness. When we look back at the history of men, we were often admired for being able to traverse to dangerous places, carry handfuls of courage, and hunt wild boars or other animals. All knew that if men did that well, the women and children could sleep safely. As our society changed, now the wild boars are pigs in the stockyard, and the rushing rivers or waterfalls are art pieces at the Museum of Modern Art's courtyard. The activity of men we were once loved and cherished for is no longer required. Men dare to enter the realms of animals, engage them, fight them, wrestle with the soul of the animal, learn their dances, cross through the veil to them. Some men entered into the realm of the spirit to wrestle with spirits, outwitted them, and saved people who had become ill through the mischievous activities of those spirits. But during the last 40 or 50 years, men have been asked to learn how to go with the flow, how to follow rather than lead, how to live in a non-hierarchical way, how to be vulnerable, how to adopt compromising decision-making. Such women want a passive man if they want a man at all, and the church wants a tamed man, The university wants a domesticated man. The corporations want a team worker, and so on. Passivity increases exponentially as the education schools turns out products of systems. The average American child by 18 has seen well over 4,000 hours of commercials, yet very few televisions have been smashed by axes. This doesn't even include the content online that children are now overwhelmed with on their phones. Men are pushed into a very tricky situation in the ever-changing world, as he may have struggled against his father, or had a narcissistic mother who wants to change him. And so when the boy fails to get free, then he learns to sulk. When this happens, we close up, tighten, and we probably refuse to speak about our hurt feelings, and may not speak at all. When a man sulks, he becomes passive to his own hurts, and when no ritual elder comes to help, the habit of passivity spreads to other parts of his life. This passive man may not say what he wants, and the girlfriend or wife has to guess it. As a compensation for passivity at home, he may go into a robotic production at work, but this isn't really what he wants either. If we go further, the passive man asks his children to do the loving for him. The passive man may skip over parenting. Parenting means feeling, but it also means lots of tasks. Taking the kids to school, buying them jackets, attending concerts, setting rules, or checking on who a child's friends are. The passive man leaves his wife to do that. Finally, a passive husband or lover may avoid being active in a woman's life. As we see more and more passivity in men, we also see more and more naivety. The naive man feels a pride in being attacked. If his girlfriend or wife shouts that he is a chauvinist, he doesn't fight back, but just takes it. He opens his shirt so that she can see more clearly where to put the lances. He ends with 3 or 4 javelins sticking out of his body and blood running all over the floor. If he were a bullfighter, he would remain where the bull is when it charges, and then the horns would pierce him. After each fight, friends would have to carry him to the hospital. The naive man feels, as he endures these attacks, that he is doing the brave and advanced thing, as if he'll be able to recover in isolation. The naive man will also be proud that he can pick up the pain of others. He particularly picks up the women's pain. He is often more in touch with women's pain than with his own, and he will offer to carry a woman's pain before he checks with his own heart to see if this labor is proper in the situation. In general, I think each gender drops its own pain when it tries to carry the pain of the other gender. I don't mean that men shouldn't listen, but hearing a woman's pain and carrying it are two different things. Women have tried for centuries to carry men's pain, and it hasn't worked out well. The word special is important to the naive man, and he has a special relationship with certain people. We all have some special relationships, but he surrounds the special person with a cloying kind of goodwill. The relationship is so special that he never examines the dark side of a person. He accepts responses that are way off and conspires with their dark side by saying, "Some people are special." The naive man will lose what is most precious to him because of the lack of boundaries. This is particularly true with the New Age man or the seeker of higher consciousness. He tells his white light experiences at parties. The naive man tends to have an inappropriate relation to ecstasy. He longs for ecstasy at the wrong time, or in the wrong place, and ignores all masculine sources of it. He uses ecstasy to be separated from grounding or discipline. The naive man will sink into a mood, as if into a big hole, as if the man's mood seems to be attached as if to a mountain. If he feels hurt or low, he identifies with the mood, and everyone around him has to go down into the hole too. The naive man often doesn't know that there is a being in him that wants to remain sick. Inside each man or woman, there is a sick person and a well person, and one needs to know which one is talking at any moment. But awareness of the sick being, and knowledge of how strong he is not part of the naive man's field of perceptions. A final remark about naivety. We might mention that there is something in naivety that demands betrayal. The naive man will have a curious link to betrayal, deceit, and lies. Not only will he betray others easily, being convinced his motives are always good, but when a woman lives with a truly naive man for a while, she often feels encouraged to betray him. When there is too much naivety around, the universe has no choice but to crystallize some betrayal. Next we'll speak on numbness. A spiritual man may be about freedom and light, and yet entirely numb in the chest area. It's hard to say this right, and it's not clear where the numbness comes from. Often in high school, for men the chest area remains numb, even though the head is filled with fire and blood, while the genitals might be fiery and curious too. The area in between becomes the problem. In high school, a girl might ask, "Do you love me?" A numb person couldn't answer, and if they asked the same question back, she might reply, "Well, I respect you, and I admire you, and I'm fond of you, and I'm very interested in you, but I don't love you." Apparently, when she looked into her chest, she saw a spectrum of affections, a whole procession of feelings, and she could easily tell them apart. For the numb man, they will look to their chest and feel nothing, so they will either remain silent or fake it. Some women feel hurt when a man will not express his feelings, and they may conclude that he is holding back, or telling them something by such withholding. But it's more likely that when such a man asks a question out of his chest, he gets no answer at all. And so as we get back to the story, as I was a golden boy in the story embodying the ascender and a flyer, after I left the spring, then Iron John is quite correct as he said to me, "You know a great deal about gold now, but nothing about poverty." In effect, he says, "You know a lot about going up, and nothing about going down." So if we recall, previously, Iron John said, "Go out into the world now, and there you will learn what poverty is. I see no evil in your heart. However, I wish you well, and I'll offer you this gift. Whenever you are in trouble, come to the edge of the forest and shout, 'Iron John! Iron John! Iron John!' and I'll come to the edge of the forest and help you. My power is great, much greater than you believe, and I have gold and silver in abundance." After that I left the forest and walked by the beaten and unbeaten paths, ever onwards, until at length I reached a great city. There I looked for work, but could find none, and I had learned nothing by which I could help myself. At length I went to the palace and asked if they would take me in. The people in the court did not know at all what to do with me, or what use I would be to them, but they liked me, and so they told me to stay. Before long, a cook took me into his service, and so my job was to carry wood and water and rake the cinders together,
said the white buffalo. "You did all this? But why would you go so low? I don't understand."
To fall from being a noble father's son to being a cook is the step the story asks for. And so I carried wood and water, working in the basement of the city where the kitchen was. And this stands for the drop through the floor, the descent, the humiliation, the way down and out. For young men who have graduated from privileged colleges, or who have been lifted upwards by the expensive entitlement culture, their soul life often begins with this basement work in the kitchen. And so this leads us to Catabasis, or the journey into the underworld. This marks the descent, whether undertaken consciously or unconsciously, is a newly arrived at lowliness, associated with water and soul, as height is associated with spirit. Water prefers low places, and the lowliness happens particularly to men who are initially high, lucky, or elevated. The way down and out usually separates the young man from his companion flyers and from their support, and it makes him aware of a depression that may have been living unnoticed in him for years. A mean life of ordinariness, heaviness, silence, cracks in the road, weight, and soberness begins. In my story, I wandered around a while, having no real craft, and then at last I got a job in the kitchen, which is traditionally in the basement of a castle. My story says that after the golden fingertips and hair, what is proper for the young man is the whirlpool, the sinking through the floor, the drop, what the ancient Greeks called katabasis. There is something more than a little frightening about this drop. Our ego doesn't want to do it, and even if we drop, the ego doesn't want to see it. Listen to the sounds in katabasis, harsh and abrupt. It feels right for this trip. What I am saying then is that the next step in initiation for men is finding the rat's hole. The rat's hole is a dark way, the one you can't prepare for. The trip that upwardly mobile man imagines only lower class men take. It's the way down and out. When katabasis happens, a man no longer feels like a special person. He is not. One day he is in college, being fed and housed, and the next day he is walking the streets looking for a meal and a bed. People know immediately when you are falling or have fallen. Doormen turn their backs on you. Waiters sneer. No one holds the subway car door for you. Your inner psychology changes as an old shame surfaces. One walks with the head down and feels like it's all inevitable. The inner masculine self changes. While one is still grandiose and naive, a young man lives inside, shiny-faced, expectant, hopeful, dandified, a prince. After the descent begins, and the old man takes the place of the prince, to one's amazement, a helpless, antisocial, brittle, isolated derelict takes over. Katabasis comes about through addiction, and so a young man loses his health, ends up with flat energy, out of shape, deprived of friends, a house, or money. He loses his job and self-respect and every mark of his former art and life. To a man deeply involved in his work, the katabasis can appear without earth addiction or ill health. A man may even still do well in business, live a sweet life with home and family, and enjoy the weekends at Tahoe. Then one Sunday morning, he finds himself on the lawn with a loaded gun about to pull the trigger. He lives, but loses every shred of his former art and life. We remember that in the story of Joseph's coat of many colors, his brothers put him down into a gravel pit. A few days later, they sell him to slave traders, who in turn take him still further down into Egypt, where he makes a third descent into a dungeon after offending the leader's wife. It is as if life itself somehow discharges him. There are many ways of being discharged: a serious accident, the loss of a job, the breaking of a long-standing friendship, a divorce, a breakdown, and illness. Carl Jung had a great outlook for this, and so if a friend reported enthusiastically, "I have just been promoted," Jung would say, "I'm very sorry to hear that, but if we all stick together, I feel that we will get through it." Now if a friend arrived depressed and ashamed saying, "I've just been fired, oh, I've got nothing left," Jung would say, "Let's open a bottle of nice wine. This is wonderful news. Something good will come now." We could say that Iron John discharged me after 3 days at the sacred spring. In my story, as I did the kitchen work, it means working with the strengthening of the dripping. The descender makes an exit from ordinary and respectable life through the wound. The wound now is thought of as a door. If some parental event or cultural pressure separates a young man's head from his body, he'd be stuck in the position of the observer. And this time in his katabasis, he becomes really stuck. The way down and out doesn't require poverty, homelessness, physical deprivation, or dishwasher work, but it does seem to require a fall from status, from a human being to a spider, from middle-class person to a derelict. The emphasis is on the consciousness of the fall, and the energies that demand katabasis have immense powers at their control. Katabasis also carries with it the whole concept of disaster, perhaps bringing it into the man's life for the first time. One has the sense that some power in the psyche arranges a severe katabasis if the man does not know enough to go down on his own. Depression is a small katabasis, and something other than us arranges it,
said the white buffalo. But I don't understand. This is horrific and horrible. What am I going to make of all this chaos that swirls?
With initiators gone from our culture, we do not receive instructions on how to go down on our own. We could use the phrase, going into grief, for the conscious act of descent. But one sometimes feels that in the United States, a man is supposed to feel grief only at a funeral. The long, difficult repentance is a way of the descent, though I prefer the verticality of catabasis and the image of a door. Drinking can lead to this door for some. Instead of repeating, I can handle it, and I'm never out of control, such a man says, I'm an alcoholic. And so the 12 steps of AA take him down in an initiation to bring him back to himself. On the way down, one receives a little instruction about the dark side of God. The dark side of God in India is called Kali, and only Shiva, one of the forms of the wild man, can stand up to her. And that gives a hint as to why in our story it is the wild man who guides the initiation process. Now, with all this being said, the idea here is that a good king cannot become an actual leader and a true king until he has exchanged places for a year with the king of the underworld. That means for a year he will stay beside the Black Darling, or queen of the underworld. Something wants us down there, to meet with this dark queen. The only solution to the power of this witch is when we learn to develop energy as great as hers, as harsh, as wild, as shrewd, as clear in its desire. When I arrived at her dark home in the underworld, I had to prove myself to be up to her level of intensity, purpose, and respected for the truth. Then she said,
Okay, what do you want to know?
This descent, or kitchen work, can take 3 other forms. We'll name these as taking the road of ashes, learning to shudder, and moving from the mother's world into the father's world. In my story, the cook took me into service and said I should carry fire and water. Then I would rake the cinders together. This is a reference to ashes. Ashes do not belong to the sunlit crown of the tree, nor to its strong roots. Ash is literally the death of the trunk. Ashes and cinders in fairy tales are code words for the ashy, sooty, depressed, and out-of-it time of our lives. We imagine in our day that to be assigned to the stove, kitchen, or hearth is some sort of punishment. But in fairy tales, that assignment goes to the lucky one, who is the magical ashy fool, or Cinderella, who is the magical suffering child. For those type of children, tending the hearth is the right task. To live the life of ashes is very different from dropping into catabasis. It doesn't require a fall in social status. It is not so explosive. There is something about ashes that is steady. It's a very even lethargic feeling. Initiation says that before a boy can become a man, some infantile being in him must die. Ashes is a time to set aside for the death of that ego-bound boy. And if a man is gold-obsessed, it's thought to be a man who hasn't yet handled the ashes. The word ashes contains in it a feeling of death. Many men in their 30s and 40s will begin to experience ashes privately, without ritual, even without an elder or older man guiding them. They begin to notice how many of their dreams have turned to ashes. Just as a fire in its early years, for example, a man in his 20s, may burn with a good draft, then later on in life, the debris will pile up and we'll have to get down on our hands and knees to clean out the ashes. Ashes present a great diminishment away from the living tree, with its huge crown and abundant shade. The recognition of this diminishment is proper experience for men who are over 30. If a man doesn't experience that diminishment sharply, he will retain his inflation and continue to identify himself with all in him that can fly. His sex drive, his mind, his addictions, his coolness. The coolness of some men means they have skipped ashes. Catabasis and ashes are a little different. We could say that a man finds catabasis only through drooping, poverty, abrupt change in social class, and a prison is a traditional place to experience both catabasis and ashes. But a man may keep his job and family and still experience ashes if he knows what he is doing. And so for help, we can turn to God. The descent has another face, which we will call learning to shudder. Children are able to shudder easily, and a child will often break into tears when he or she sees a wounded animal. But later, the domination system enters, and some boys begin to torture and kill insects and animals to cover their own insignificance. Boys at that point become titans. We can recall that Zeus defeated the titans and put them below the earth, but they remained around and later accidentally ate Dionysus, their grandson, the shudderer, the one who could feel grief. In his anger, Zeus burned the titans to ashes. But for human beings, the story says, were made from the ashes. Dionysus himself was reconstituted from his heart, which the titans did not get. It is such a marvelous mythological idea to have human beings created out of the titans' ashes. It helps explain our own cruelty and coldness. Of course, we also received in the ashes Dionysus's body, but not the heart. Alas, we can say then that it is Dionysus, the last of the Greek gods to be deployed, who guides that secret process in which the young man, or young woman, learns to shudder. After the adolescent years, a young man needs to learn precisely what the titans never did learn. That is the legitimate aim of initiation. Gaining the ability to shudder means feeling how frail human beings are, and how awful it is to be a titan. When one is shuddering, the shudder helps take away the numbness we spoke of. When a man possesses empathy, it does not mean that he has only developed the feminine feeling. Of course he has, but when he learns to shudder, he is developing a part of the masculine emotional body as well. Next we must cover going from the mother's house to the father's house. When initiation is in place, the old men help the boys to move from the mother's world to the father's world. Boys have lived happily since birth in the mother's world, and the father's world naturally seems to be dangerous, unsteady, and full of the unknown. So the first stage then is a clean break with the mother. That happens in our story when the wild man takes the boy on his shoulders. But a break is only a break, and it doesn't imply any internal movement inside the body. Simply put, the young man needs to move from the mother's house to the father's house. A man's effort to move to the father's house takes a long time. It's difficult, and each man has to do it for himself. Moving to the father's world does not necessarily mean rejecting the mother or shouting at her, but rather the movement involves convincing the naive boy or the comfort-loving boy to die. The man today, as he embarks toward the father's house, is between these two mythologies. If he is an ascender, he flees from the earth, water, dust, and flesh, and effectively asks women to take care of the earth. By contrast, the only men in traditional initiation lead the young man to the beneath father, near where the ancestors live, and where the snakes are. That voyage does not exile him from heaven, for snakes can be found even at the crown of the tree. The snakes swim in water as well. The snake is the lord of the waters. Mythologically then, the snake resembles the wild man, the king, and other beings who live in the water at the bottom of our psyches. In summary, when a man accepts the descent as a way to move to the father's house, he learns to look at the dead side of things. He glances down the rat's hole, which also is the snake's hole, and he accepts the snake rather than the bird as his animal. Initiation asks the young man to move his love energy away from the attractive mother to the relatively unattractive serpent father. All of that is Ash's work. When a man enters this stage, he regards the descent as a holy thing. He increases his tolerance for ashes, eats dust as snakes do, increases his stomach for terrifying insights, deepens his ability to digest the evil facts of history, accepts the job of working under the ground, leaves the granary at will through the rabbit's hole, chews on cinders, learns to shudder, and follows the voice of the old mole below the ground. During each stage of Iron John's initiation process, a masculine god has taken part. Apollo is present at the spring, and we could say that concealed in the ashes work, there is the old Mediterranean god, Saturn, the natural container of restraint, melancholy, vast systems, disciplined repetition, mentor standards, and heavy grieving. When Saturn is present, the failure just sits there solidly and is not to be explained away. Saturn then helps men to get heavy with the full weight of their wound and the full power of their failures. After Saturn introduces a man to the Lord of Melancholy, that man begins the black courtship of the soul, which eventually leads the man to the garden,
said the white buffalo.